So I make it 11 o'clock. If everybody's ready to go. To our attendees, thank you for joining us, especially given that we appreciate there's probably a lot of stresses and strains at the moment for you guys. My name is Damien Johnston with Primary Care Direct. This is a premises and estates planning kind of update that we're delivering. And I won't say too much, but I will hand you across to Rob James, who's Managing Director at Apollo Medical, and following that, Kate Salt, who's a Relationship Director with Lloyds Bank, will take you through some of the key points to bear in mind. I've mentioned it already, but there is a Q&A facility down at the bottom of the screen, which if you do have any questions, do feel free to open that up. Do feel free to fire away. And what we'll do is we'll try and squeeze any responses in at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Rob, who will take you through a few areas from the architectural perspective. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Damien. Yeah, as Damien said, Apollo Capital Projects are primary care experts in all aspects, predominantly in development and planning. And today I'd like to speak to you about how we can assist primary care networks in forward planning for their estate. So in terms of the estate, what's important is to create an estate strategy. And why is that important? The estate with PCNs can be quite wide-ranging, and it's important that you understand what part of your estate is going to be impacted by patient growth, what areas you want to expand services into, and you look at things like compliance issues, which are the best positioned assets, how the PCN will impact on business development, and indeed with succession planning, and how the estate strategy would fit in with these, and also the best fit within the estate. So your estate could have different properties in there, which could include outdated properties, converted residential properties, but also some ultra-modern properties as well. So you need to consider which are the best for delivering services for the PCN as a whole, and how that fits within the estate strategy. So what will it tell us? So the estate strategy could tell you what the sufficiency of the building is in terms of how it's being used and whether it is efficient in its use. The utilization of the space, whether all space is underutilized, overutilized, or is about right. The measure the NHS tend to use is 75% utilization of space is optimal. Anything above that starts to put pressures on the system. Anything under that is generally underutilized. So you need to look at that across the entire estate. It looks at compliance in terms of the relevant health building notes and health technical memorandum, and also the CQC in terms of compliance. Any red flags have been raised over anything within the PCN estate. It also looks at the condition of the estate in a very broad terms on whether there is money to be spent on backlog maintenance or internal refurbishment to bring it up for compliance standards. It should also note on value and debt. So essentially what the value of the estate is, whether owned or leased, and what debt is held on the estate as well in terms of loans, the length of those loans, and the repayment strategy for those. So what tends to arise from the estate strategy when it's completed and what the next steps are is you decide whether what the current state is, whether repurposing of some of the existing premises is required. So for instance, you could make certain buildings predominantly admin based and then move more front facing into other facilities. You could look at extending existing facilities through premises grants, premises improvement grants. You need to look at your disposal strategy in terms of the entire PCM, but the partnerships as well, whether redundant buildings or older buildings could be disposed, and whether that could facilitate then partners' strategy for retirement or succession strategies. There's also sale and lease back to the possibility of releasing equity and capital back into the partnership, and there are many companies on the market to do that. And there's also then the possibility that the strategy will identify that you need to look for a new development as part of the ongoing PCN, and the location of that, whether you want to lease it or whether you want to own it, and then the figures which go along with that. So just to, my last slide here, just to see how Apollo could help that. We are experienced developers. We've got over 20 years experience in the market, and amongst the people who work in Apollo, there's over 80 years of experience working in primary care alone. We are predominantly developers, but we carry out a consultancy role for GPs who do wish to develop premises themselves. We're flexible in terms of the way we approach, either a consultant or as a developer. We work nationally with offices that cover the entire breadth of the UK. We're only focused on primary care. We don't work in acute care. We don't work in residential, in care homes. We are only working in primary care. And because of that, we tend to form long-term relationships with CCGs and with other healthcare partnerships. And we do understand this is a team working ethic. It only works if we do work as a team. And that's the way we drive schemes forward, because there are a huge amount of legacy issues which we do need to consider when we are looking at new developments, extensions, sale and leaseback, and all the gamut of options available to us. So that's my part of it. My contact details are there, and I'm sure you'll have a copy of the slides later, and I will then pass on to Kate for the next section.
Hi, morning everyone. Thank you ever so much, Rob. I'm Kate Salt. I'm a relationship director specialising in healthcare in the northwest of England. Today I'm going to focus on funding for GP surgery. Apologies, I'm on my phone here, so hence the scrolling slides. I hope it's not too distracting. So just to give you a quick overview of some of the kind of key points that we would look at in terms of funding for GP development. A lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today are still applicable in terms of large-scale refurbishment, and indeed the principles as such are still important for just general funding for GP surgery. So we can look at 100% loan to value, or up to 100% loan to value, or loan to gross development value. On occasion, we can increase that to 105 in very specific circumstances. Repayment is the overriding consideration for us. Ultimately, you want to pay the debt back and we want you to do so. So that is the core sort of overriding consideration. We would need to look at core income for notional rent, and that being sort of from the GP surgery, and any top up being from pharmacy, which or any other NHS supplier, which we do see very commonly in GP developments. The notional rent needs to be agreed at the outset, and there also needs to be leases in place again at the outset before we start to look at the development. Now, we can look at a term of up to 25 years. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that and look a bit further through the document. But as I say, the bank can offer a committed term on the loan of up to 25 years. So looking at GP development in a little bit more detail, and some of the considerations and issues to take into account. Now, we would look for 75% of the floor space to be covered by the core contract relating to the GMS or PMS contract. Again, loan serviceability is absolutely key, and we will look for 75% of that to come from the notional rent, cost rent generated from the practice.
I saw a video.
As I said before, any additional debt servicing from a good quality tenant and with a proven income source. And again, we would typically look at pharmacy when we're talking about that. In terms of repayment, we would look at 100% of the loan being covered by the rent and other income. Now, that is lower than we would look at in probably most other businesses, so that is a little bit different for GP farms, GP developments, and indeed GP buy-ins, etc. We do stress, and this is slightly unusual given where interest rates have gone to in the last week or so, we would still stress test against a 3.5% base rate. Ultimately, we want the debt to be repaid again, so do you, and we need to have certainty of where that income is coming from. We can also look at interest only for up to 50% of the loan to value. Again, we can look at that for the full term of the loan, and we need some certainty around what would be the alternative use or the ultimate repayment over a longer term. Now, the above does assume a traditional partnership models we typically see in GP practices, so where we're lending to the GP partners themselves. And we also would take account of age profiles, etc., as well, so that we've got reasonable time frames for looking at that debt serviceability piece. So just to kind of highlight the key things here, to the turning paper. So again, we're looking at notional rent, another rent to be 100% of the debt repayment as a minimum. If it's too tight, what do we look at in terms of other income available? Again, we've mentioned the pharmacy, any other NHS tenants potentially. Is it worthwhile considering any positive impact of capital allowances? Again, as I stressed before, we do stress test for the interest rate changes. Again, we have seen them come down, but we look at that 3.5%. And the most important thing around that is if interest rates do rise, can the repayments be met? So some of the detail on this is Lisa will also highlight in her sort of little slot in a few minutes' time. So other considerations, and a lot of this around advice, getting good advice from good quality people. So making sure you've got accountancy advice around structures, including tax, a good solicitor, and getting a partnership agreement at the outset is, I think, essential in this situation. Consider any partnership changes in the future. That might be succession planning, it might be bringing in new people, it may be retiring partners over a term of, say, 25 years, which is potentially likely. And also consider the end game or sort of strategy over a long period, whether that might be growing into a larger merger situation, age of partners, and alternative uses over the period of the loan. So in terms of funding, where do we start? Which is always kind of, I think, a good place to start, I guess. We like to know anything that's going on earlier the better for us, so we can be fully informed throughout the process, and it gives us lots of chance and opportunity to look at the due diligence alongside the GP partners and the other professionals. So what do we need? I mean, I say a business plan here, and that could happen over a discussion, but having some sort of formalised agreement, I think, between the GP partners and any other third parties is a good place to start. So looking at what you're trying to achieve, timescales, size, ensuring you've got the right team around you. So that's who and sort of why and who's involved. Do you have the NHS support or CTG support at the outset in terms of notional rent? And looking at third parties in terms of pharmacy or other key tenants, engaging with them early, coming up with a plan with them in terms of how, what that relocation might look like in terms of their business and how you move forward with them. And indeed, looking at how, when we're planning at the outset, how something can be fit for the future when we're looking at something over a period of, say, 25 years. So this slide, again, this goes into quite a lot of detail just around getting the right people in. Lisa will go into this in a little bit more detail, so I will kind of cover it very, very quickly. I mean, we would reiterate that having the right people around you is absolutely essential. That comes from the building to the professionals and the other, the other third parties that you'll be working with on an ongoing basis. So it's very easy to sit back sort of 1, 2, 3 years down the line and look at something in hindsight. These are a few of the common issues that we do see. As I say, it's always easy to look back, but kind of identifying the key risks at the outset means that you can find a solution as you're going along. Now, here I've highlighted just a few of the key ones that we've come across with GP surgery development, and indeed any other kind of development, whether it's somebody's own home, right through to something of scale of this. So typically looking at things like cost overruns, the sort of builder being an excellent quality, good track record. It is really essential to sort of choose carefully, as it says there. With a good old British weather, we can see site problems. So it's about just mitigating that around sort of timing for the development as far as possible, or as reasonably as possible. Again, making sure that everybody that you are working with has the right level of experience, and that's something that we would fully support in terms of, you know, as I said, everyone from your accountant right through to the builder on site. Get involved as early as you can. Being involved too late makes it really difficult, for sort of more challenging, I guess, to make sure that we shape everything in the right way. So as I say, the earlier the better. And again, make sure that you've got agreement with the NHS from an early outset. So very quickly, in terms of security, it's very, very straightforward what we would look for. Now, assuming a sort of traditional partnership model, we would be looking at first charge of the GP surgery, collateral warranties. If we are looking at a limited company, which we do see on occasion, we would then be looking at a debenture and a top size guarantee for any debt above 70% of the loan to value or the gross development cost value. Interest rates. You know, again, this is a big portion of debt, and it is a risk and one that's worth taking into consideration. Now, worthwhile looking at the different options, and there's a page in the end of here which I won't go through in any particular detail, but just to look at the difference between variable and fixed rates in terms of certainty and flexibility. Now, I think we price our debt, we look at debt on a basis of a base rate. As I said before, we do sensitise it over 3.5% being the base rate. So, you know, we'd look at affordability at the outset, and we'd hope that, you know, with etc., interest rates are, you know, not looking at they'll be as high as that, but it is important to take into consideration. Commitment term on the bottom here is really important when you're looking at different options for funding, whether you've got, I said at the outset, we can fund for up to 25 years. We can also commit to a loan for a shorter period of time, which means that the debt service cost is lower because our margin is lower. It's something that's very important if you're comparing different sort of funding offers that you have on the table, if you're looking at a selection of different funding options, just to make sure that you're comparing apples with apples. So when you're looking at interest rates, what happens if they increase? Now, we would talk through that with you, so you've got, you know, fully informed at the outset. If you look at that commitment period of, say, 5 years, and you've got an underlying term of, say, 25, what happens at the end of 5 years? Would you be looking at a renewal fee? Could you be looking at additional valuation costs, potentially any additional security costs if you were looking at a different provider at that point of time? Most importantly, looking at, is funding available? And that's important to consider if you do look at that shorter term commitment. Now, this is a slide which I won't go through in detail, but does give you an overview when the slides are shared later of what the differences are in between fixed and variable rates. Fixed is typically what we do on our personal mortgages. So it's sort of exactly what it says on the tin. You fix that rate for the term that you would wish to use. So now that could be up to 25 years if you had a 25-year loan. That gives you absolute certainty over what your debt serviceability will be month by month for the duration of the loan. Versus that, we've got a fully flexible option in terms of variable rates, which means you can make over repayments with no cost, but be mindful of, as you've probably seen in the last week, interest rates coming down means that you pay a lower amount in terms of monthly repayment. If they go, then you would look at a higher repayment. Thank you very much for listening to me, and if you've got any questions, please come forward and ask. Thanks ever so much, and I'll hand over to Lisa.
Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
I think everything's okay. Yes, Lisa, yeah.
You can hear me, great. Apologies, I don't think you're going to be able to see me, just a few IT hitches, but you might be relieved about that. So thanks very much, everybody. I'm just going to spend, we've got about 10 minutes left, but I'll leave a couple of minutes for questions. So we're just sorting out, there we go. So, welcome. My name's Lisa Geary. I'm a partner at Capsticks. I specialise in property law, and in particular in the context of dealing with the primary care estate. So I spend about 50% of my time advising P practices on their property requirements. So This slide really is just reminding you of the policy drivers that are sitting behind the primary care estate at the moment. I'm not going to spend any time running through them. We can share a link with you to a webinar that we did a few months ago on the premises review that talks about those in a little bit more detail, which I think is very useful for you to listen to in the context of all your property requirements. But that really is the backdrop, and there's a lot going on in the world of primary care estate at the moment. It's important to understand what the links are to the policies. So Rob and Kate have talked through some of the kind of practical and the finance aspects. I think just some key initial questions before you even get to the detail of what you need to look at from a legal perspective. Firstly, how do you and your primary care network own your property or properties? So have you got leaseholds, have you got freeholds, have you got a mix? And how then do you achieve your aim with that mix? Secondly, before you start with the bigger stuff, you need to make sure that your housekeeping is up to date. And by that, I mean things like, have you got an up-to-date partnership agreement that deals with the property? Have you got the freehold or leasehold vested in the correct names if you've had partners retire? Have you updated your property titles to reflect that change in ownership? Have you got the right declarations of trust setting out how the parties hold the equity in the property? Really, really important. Can lead to all sorts of tax issues and practical issues if you don't do it when you're meant to. And you really will need that in order in able to move with your plans. Then secondly, how do you want to own your property in future? You may own it freehold now. You might find that you're suffering with getting new GPs in because they don't want to buy into a capital asset. So do you want to try and convert that hold into a leasehold? Are you going to be looking at a self-funded build, in which case you'll hang on to the freehold, or do you want to do a third-party developer build, in which case you'll be converting your freehold into a leasehold? Think about your succession plans. So if you've got a strong succession plan, then it may be that you can hang on to your freehold, but if not, do you need to look at different options? So really thinking about who's about to retire and the demographics of the current partnership, and also likelihood to recruit, and what the property landscape will need to look like to maximise your chances of getting new recruits. Does your practice plan link to any estate strategies in your primary care network? So you might be thinking of doing a new development, but actually what else is going in the network? Because there can't be too many developments. It could be that there is already a hub planned with some of the other practices, so maybe it would be good to talk to them. Talk to the STP, talk to your CCG, find out what's happening before you jump in without being fully informed. And that's why it's important and necessary. Are there any strict timelines or compliance issues to be resolved? It could be that actually, you really do need to move quickly because you've got CQC on your back. You've possibly got issues with health and safety. You might have issues with the fabric of the building. You might not be compliant with the Disability Discrimination Act if you're sitting in an old Victorian property where, there isn't adequate disabled access, and all of those things are, you're going to have pressure put on you. So are you under a lot of pressure to make changes quickly? And if so, how do you navigate that? Really important to have sight of the key stakeholders who can facilitate your vision. NHS England, the CCG. It could be there are other bodies within your locality who are interested in making changes. That could be the local authority, it could be the police, it could be other healthcare bodies. So have a think about what else is going on and get chatting to people. Key initial questions: how are you going to fund the development? How much risk do you want to take? How much control do you want to retain? What are the legal barriers, legal title barriers to development? What are the key legal issues? So I'm just throwing those questions out there. There's a lot to talk about under each of those headings. We haven't got time today, but they're really key things for you to think about. If you don't want much risk, you might want to do a third-party development. But if you relinquish control, if you relinquish responsibility, you'll also relinquish control, and that might not work with the ethos. It may be that actually the partnership want to retain control, but obviously that brings with it an acceptance of risk. Legal titles to barriers to development. Know your property, know the title, take some legal advice. It could be that there's a restrictive covenant on there preventing you from building, or only allowing you to build within certain limits. It may be that you have to go and get various consents to move forward with your development. And all of this will affect timescales and possibly the ability to what you want to do. So really important to look at that at the outset. This slide lists the key advisors. There are a lot of them out there. Really important. You don't necessarily need all of them, but do talk to people and work out, you know, what input you need. You are going to need legal advice. You are going to need funding advice and valuation advice, and you probably need to talk to investors and developers too. So most times you're going to need most of the support from those people on that slide, but in varying degrees. This slide just gives you an idea of the ownership split of the primary care estate. As you can see, there are lots of different owners. So you will possibly own, you might be a tenant of a commercial landlord, you might be a tenant of NHSPS or community health partnerships. Could be that some of the retired partners have hung on to ownership of the primary care estate. It might be that another healthcare body is your landlord. And all of those will require different approaches if you want to develop your property. Sometimes there can be problems where the property is owned by retired partners and current partners, and the retired partners want to do something with it, but the current partners want to do something with it, but the retired partners don't want to. And if it involves a sale to a third-party developer, you will have issues if you can't get agreement with the retired partners, which might ending up in court in terms of forcing any sale. So it's worth just working out what the potential barriers could be based on the ownership. So if you own the freehold, you could do your own build, or you could retain the property. You could maybe acquire a new site, or you could develop your existing site, or you might want to do the third-party development, which is to sell, take a lease back. Just mentioning some of the things for you to think about where you've got the retired partners and consents to sale, but also where you are moving to a potential new development. That might mean you need to have some surplus estate, so you might want to sell, but can you? We very often see that can be a barrier to moving forward with new developments, because the alternative use for your current property is of lesser value, and that's prohibitive for the current partners, both in terms of any equity they might have and the discharge of any funding and wanting to realise full value. If you've got a lease, is the lease about to end, or do you have early break rights? All very important to check, because actually some of these can actually prevent you doing what you want to do, or might just need expert advice in working out how you can approach those challenges. If you've got a leasehold, you could still do a self-build, but does your lease permit it? It could be that you approach the landlord and ask the landlord to develop. You will need NHS approval to any lease changes. Really important that that's addressed at the outset. And potentially you might need other consents, including landlord and maybe some previous owners. Funding, different sorts of funding streams. Obviously you've got public sector funding from the NHS, you've got, and that depends on whether you own it freehold or leasehold. NHS England also has the power to make grant funds available. As we all know, the Premises Cost Directions is under review. We have had the ETTF, but that's coming to an end next year. So it's watch this space in terms of what the next stream of funding will be. But generally what we see is a combination. So it could be funding from NHS England through the Premises Cost Directions or the ETTF, combined with some private lending, perhaps through a bank like Lloyds. Maybe if you're lucky, DH grants, and maybe if you've done some early engagement with the local planning authority or the CCG to put pressure on the local planning authority, you might have been lucky enough to get planning contributions through Section 106 or Community Infrastructure Levy. This slide lists the key legal documents, so it's important to take advice on what you may or may not need. And this slide really just sets out some examples of new developments that we've worked on recently. Say a new hub that was built for 2 practices by a third-party developer with disposals of their current practice premises. We've dealt with an extension and refurbishment by a tenant where the landlord gap funded through the ETTF, and then there was an extended lease to allow the landlord to recover investment. And then a landlord extension using ETTF monies paid to the tenant, some Section 106 monies and some private lending, combined with an extended lease to give that extra rental income. So lots of innovative ways of doing it. And we're running out of time. We've come to the end. Very much a whistle-stop tour through some of the key issues, and I'm aware that there's a lot to take in. Well, how much time we've got for questions, but if you did need to contact me for any reason, those are my details. I'm very happy to have a chat with you about any of these aspects and also about your own particular requirements. Thank you very much for joining.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Rob, as well. The usual plan is to hang around online for around about 10 minutes. So any attendees who have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A facility and ask them now, and our team of experts will address them as best they can. Alternatively, the slides will be shared with everybody registered. Likewise, this webinar will go onto the Primary Care Direct webinar page, so you can access the information again. So yeah, if you have any questions, do feel free to ask now. As mentioned, we'll hang around for around about 5–10 minutes and do our best to answer any issues.